what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about a bit of the history and putting David Woolf Marks, who was quite an incredible and an interesting man, in the context of English Jewry and his own background in Victorian Britain. Some of you will know, but some of you may not know, that my synagogue's full title is the West London Synagogue of British Jews. When I first came to West London, that's quite long and interesting and a bit Victorian. The reason why it was chosen is a very interesting reason, was to allow people, whether they were Ashkenazi or Sephardi, to feel equally welcome. And in our council room, in our building, to this very day, that is underlined. And what David Woolf Marks came into his adulthood at a time when there was a lot of tension, it's not too strong a word, between being Jewish, and we can talk about what that meant at that time, and being British. As you probably know, the Jews were readmitted into England under Cromwell in 1656. And they, thankfully, they really flourished. And so they became more and more accepted into, I'm going to say, English society. I know there were people in Scotland and Wales, but for the purpose of David Woolf Marks, it really is English society. Now, what that meant is they wanted to live in a world where Jews felt comfortable with their fellow citizens. And that's relevant to David Woolf Marks because the second oldest Jewish organization in the country is the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which you've probably all heard of. For those of you who are wondering which is the oldest, it's the Initiation Society, because when you had Jewish boys being born, obviously you need Brit Milah, you need circumcision. Now, in 1760, the Sephardi community established the Standing Committee. Deputados is the Portuguese. Then the Ashkenazim followed suit, and the two groups united in the 1810s. So we have the Jewish community in Victorian Britain becoming very much wanting to be English gentlemen of the Jewish persuasion, and how different people did that was a source of interest and tension, I think, from that day to this in different ways. And of course, we have to bear in mind that the Sephardi gentlemen of Bevis Marks had been in the country longer than the Ashkenazi gentlemen of the Great Synagogue. Now, it's very important because the Sephardi families, the great Sephardi families, some of whom had intermarried with the English aristocracy already, moved to the West End, and they went to the Askamah to say, we'd like, Askamah as the Synagogue Council of Bevis Marks, to say, we'd like an offshoot, a daughter synagogue. And the Askamah said, no. I think because they were fearful of some kind of independence. So they didn't let it lie, interestingly. On the 15th of April, 1840, there was a meeting held at the Bedford Hotel in Southampton Row. Now, look at the numbers, 24 gentlemen, 19 of them Sephardi. And that's very relevant because Sephardi Hebrew was there in West London Synagogue and therefore in the whole Reform movement and in the Liberal movement from the very first day. Interestingly, and I said these were Sephardi gentlemen who were well established in England, quite a lot of them were related to each other, and they were also related to some of the great elders of Bevis Marks and the Great Synagogue. But they decided, they signed a declaration to say, we want greater decorum because they felt uncomfortable. They felt their English neighbours would feel terribly uncomfortable if they saw the sort of chaos that was often what happened in the synagogues. And crucially, They wanted decorum. They wanted a sermon in English because, of course, much was done, particularly in Bevis Marks, in Portuguese, actually. And of course, much was done in many of the Ashkenazi synagogues in Yiddish. And they were finding already that the children and even the young people who were adults were disenfranchised. And I'm going to put it strong, and I'm going to say disenchanted. This really wasn't for them. And bear in mind, 1840 is important because the Queen Victoria is becoming significant. Girls and boys equally should have a Jewish education. And they said, and if David Woolf Marks, we're going to come to it in a few moments, I hope, he wrote a very wonderful, very lengthy dedication sermon for the new synagogue in 1842. And he did talk about the significance of girls and boys, men and women, participating and being confirmed in their Jewish education at the age of 13 and learning Hebrew. Do you remember I said they were British gentlemen of the Jewish persuasion? They really were that. Quite a lot of them were not only related, they were intermarried, the Makata and Goldsmith families, who will come up in this story again and again. And Sir Isaac Goldsmith was particularly close to David Woolf Marks. Just before the dedication service on the 27th of January 1842, there was a cherem issued against the new, well, some people wouldn't even call it a synagogue, the new community, refusing permission for the members of this community to be married in a what was by then being called an Orthodox synagogue, or buried in an Orthodox graveyard. Now, some of you will probably remember earlier on in Jewish history, another radical movement in its time, maybe not so much now. The Hasidim, do you remember? There were people like the Gaon of Vilna, they were called mitnagdim, which is a fancy way of saying the opponents, because they were just against everything the Hasidim stood for. And they said as well, their opponents, the bad guys, the radicals, the rebels, could not be buried in a Jewish cemetery. And if you think about that, that's a pretty serious thing for one Jew to say to another. Now, we're going to come to when West London Synagogue, because it was not cutting edge radical, it was a very gentle evolution of non-Orthodox Judaism, did become accepted. But I'm jumping slightly ahead of myself. What they had to do in Victorian times is they had to buy their own cemetery. The Balls Pond Road in Islington and West London Synagogue still own that cemetery, and it is completely fascinating and wonderful. It's full of very eminent Victorians. Now, perhaps I shouldn't be telling you that because it's also very broken down and inaccessible at the moment. But Islington Council, together with West London, have a lottery grant, and God willing, it's going to be renovated. So they had to make big decisions because the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim were saying, not quite a curse on you, but a cherem is an edict of separation. And so in the 1850s, there's an act of parliament that allows the West London Synagogue of British Jews, give us our full title, to solemnize marriages. And to this day, and this started in the 1850s, every Reformed synagogue technically has to have its marriage secretary legitimized via the Council of the West London Synagogue. And those of you who are members of liberal synagogues will probably know that something very similar happens via the Council of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue for very similar reasons. Now, in those days, much afterwards, they wore preaching tabs. And there is an odd thing when you look at that, because you think, that's not very Jewish. But actually, pre the Second World War, Orthodox rabbis would wear dog collars. So here we have, interestingly, what I'm going to call an Anglicization that was happening across the Jewish world because people wanted to feel proud of being British Jews, English gentlemen of the Jewish persuasion. And David Woolf Marks was an extraordinary young man. When he first came to the West London Synagogue, he was a young man, and he stayed for an astonishing and an impressive 69 years. I don't think any other rabbi is ever going to equal that. He had a really rough start in his life. His father died when he wasn't yet 10, and he went to the Jews' free school, and he was so brilliant, particularly at Hebrew, interestingly, that he tutored younger boys. He read Torah. He would get a few pennies for saying Kaddish at funerals. He read Mishnah to the headmaster's wife. Now, he moved into ministry. He was never ordained. He's known as Reverend Professor. It was the university system and the ordination system, well, it didn't exist for Reform rabbis, as we know. In 1833, he moved to Liverpool. Now, Liverpool, I don't know if anyone here is from Liverpool, but it seems to have been in the 1830s and 40s, a kind of haven of what I think I'm going to call enlightened orthodoxy, because David Woolf Marks was an extraordinary young man. He became a professor at Wigan College of Hebrew. He was really, really amazing. And he became later on in life, when he read, I'm jumping forward a wee bit. When he came back to London, he became as it were, a proper academically recognized professor of Hebrew at University College. Now, he was quite a free thinker. Now, I'm using a slightly anachronistic term for the 1830s, but he was brave. He said he wasn't going to celebrate second day Yom Tov, not Pesach, not Shavuot or Sukkot. And interestingly, that put him out of sorts with orthodoxy. But he became great friends with the barrister Sir John Simon, who became important in the West London Synagogue. I'm going to read to you, bear with me please, a really interesting and brave, and I'm going to use that word of David Woolf Marks again, extraordinary letter that Marks sent to Sir John Simon in 1840, and it seems to have been, without saying as much, it was quite a job application to be the first minister of this new congregation. But it kind of had that function. Let me read it to you and see if you agree. Now, forgive me, it's a little bit flowery Victorian language, but I think it's worth saying in full. This is a direct quote from Marx. The Jew can never fight free of this charge. Criticisms of Jews and their business practice, and were kind of slightly anti-Semitic, I think, really. He can never fight free of this charge until he at once clothes it in the native purity and pristine majesty of the eternal law of Moses. Subtext from David Woolf Marks, not the Talmud, right? Then he goes on, slightly brave. Were I once firmly placed as minister to our new congregation, though my flock numbered but 10 souls, then should I have authority to reply to all these subtext anti-Semitic accusations. He was prepared to admit at once that many institutions and observances have been introduced by the rabbins, perhaps with good intent, but which have had the effect of perverting the pure principles of Judaism. Now, I think it's kind of hard to read this nearly 200 years later, but he seems to have been rather influenced by the polemic against Jewish tradition, perhaps not as well informed as he became later, because he used as an example the Kol Nidre, which we know is about, it's nothing about the vows you make to another human being, it's about vows to God. And the Pesach passage, famously not in many non-Orthodox Haggadot, pour out your wrath upon the nations. Now, again, a little disingenuous, David Woolf Marks, because it goes on that know thee not. So it is, it was slightly quoted out of context. So here he is saying, not going to do second day Yom Tov. We need to keep to the clarity of the 5 books of Moses. So, and I have asked a question, but I think I may have half answered it already. It's not quite a job application, but he is setting out his stall, and it worked. The leading thinker amongst the founders of West London Synagogue was Sir Francis Goldsmith. And they became very important members of the synagogue over generations. And like with the Macatas, with whom they were actually, they worked together. They were bullion dealers to the Bank of England, amongst other things. But what happened, remember I said right at the beginning, it's the West London Synagogue of British Jews because of the friendship, the Goldsmith, and in fact, family relationships, the Macatas and the Goldsmith. Without almost trying, they became a new Anglo-Jewish tradition. Now, before I go on, because I'm going to quote from the dedication sermon in a second, I'm going to pause. And Simon, can you see if there's anyone who wants to ask a question or make a comment?
I'm quite interested, Rabbi Helen, about the fact that, you know, like you say, he was a reverend, he wasn't ordained rabbi. When did, I don't know if you know the answers, but when did ordination for progressive rabbis start?
Well, in fact, I do know the answer to that. Well, it's complicated. Some of you will know that in Germany, who they were way ahead of Britain in progressive Judaism, and much more intellectually coherent. There was a marvelous, intellectually impressive pre-war thing called the Hochschule für des Wissenschaft des Judentums that qualified non-Orthodox rabbis. Now, some of you will have been here when one of my colleagues was talking about the late, much lamented Rabbi Dr. Ignaz Maybaum of blessed memory. He was, I think, the founder rabbi of Edgware Reform, and he was from the Hochschule. So some of the great rabbis of the early time in the Reform movement came over from continental Europe. Now, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but somebody's going to say, but what about Rabbi Israel Matuk of blessed memory? He came over from America. We didn't have our own indigenous non-Orthodox seminary until the Learbeck College. It started in 1956. Michael Berkson.
When he was in Liverpool, which was his community?
As far as I'm aware, it was the Orthodox, because there was no other way. You mean which Orthodox one?
Yes.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Why do you? It sounds like you have special knowledge of the Liverpool.
No, simply that I am from Liverpool,
Right.
and so I'm interested, obviously, and I was until I moved to London at Princess Road Synagogue.
No, I don't think. No, it wouldn't have been Princess Road. I'm pretty sure, only because he was, I think, in his way, as well, self-taught genius is often described as. But I think they would have had someone who had a classic Orthodox rabbinic coordination, probably.
Yes. Princess Road actually had problems, I think, in a later era, because their trustees provided that the rabbi had to be English born, and they did have problems getting candidates for a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting, and which is why Simon's question about when we first started ordaining English-born progressive rabbis was only 1956. some of the great rabbis that some of you on the call will remember. Certainly, I was talking with my husband, who was taught at the Leobeck College by the wonderful Ignace Maybaum of blessed memory. And some of you may remember Rabbi Dr. Werner van der Zel, also from the Hochschule. So one of the things I hope you will begin to understand that David Woolf Marks' courage and passion for a form of being British and Jewish in a way that the two things were married together in a coherent whole that was meaningful to people for whom this was part of their Jewish life. It has had enormous influence. And I'm going to come in a second to, I have a quote from the dedication sermon on the 27th of January, 1842. But I want to say something else about David Woolf Marks, that via the West London Synagogue and the Reform synagogues of Great Britain, and Montefiore, who influenced the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, progressive Jews and progressive rabbis have always been really passionately engaged with, well, now we would call it tikkun olam, probably, social justice work. And some of the founders of West London Synagogue, influenced by David Woolf Marks. There's the one I'm going to come on to if we have time, called Frederick David McCatter. And Frederick David McCatter devoted himself to philanthropy from about the 1880s. He left the family business. And what he was interested in was hospitals, education, and crucially, together with other members of the McCatter family, influenced by David Woolf Marks, slum relief in the East End. And there's some of you may know, and we've got a picture later on, there's a McCatter fountain in the East End to commemorate Frederick David McCatter, and this extraordinary thing where these wealthy members of our founding families were imbued by David Woolf Marks with a passion for what I certainly would call prophetic Judaism. If you're interested, and David Woolf Marks was famous for his sermons, there are 2 books of his sermons. He wrote a biography of Francis Goldsmith, who was important in his life. The sermons are a little bit long for modern taste, but they're full of passion for doing good. And I quoted in my own synagogue one he'd written in 1854. And he said, and this would be appropriate in 2020, you know, nearly 200 years later, he said, miss no opportunity to do good. Now, we could call that tikkun olam, could call that prophetic Judaism, both of which are accurate. And that's been in there since the beginning of Reform and Liberal Judaism, thanks to the passion of David Woolf Marks. Now, part of being a self-taught genius and a passionate arbiter of prophetic Judaism, he didn't mind a bit of controversy. He had a lot of courage. I'm going to read you a little extract from the dedication sermon of January 1842. So just when you're listening, think about what was going on in the wider world. Bear in mind, I've told you that David Woolf Marks was passionate about boys and girls having bar mitzvah, both of them. And he was passionate about men and women learning Hebrew. The Education Act of 1870 for the wider community was still to come into effect. So I think in many ways, he has been an incredibly positive influence on West London Synagogue and is way, way ahead of his time. All right, so bear with me. This is a tiny little extract for the dedication sermon. Quote, so he's talking on behalf of the West London Synagogue, we solemnly deny that a belief in the divinity of those traditions written in the Mishnah and the Jerusalem Babylonian Talmud is of equal obligation to the Israelite with a faith in the divinity of the laws of Moses. These books, he's talking about Mishnah and the Talmud, are human compositions. And though we are content to accept with reverence, advice, and instruction from our post-biblical ancestors, we cannot unconditionally accept their laws. For Israelites, there is but one immutable law, the sacred volume of the scriptures commanded by God, to be written down for the unerring guidance of his people until the end of time. Then he says, now bear in mind, we've got the Board of Deputies, we've got the United Synagogue, we've got Sir Moses Montefiore is the president of the Board of Deputies. He says, every Hebrew congregation must be authorized to take such measures as shall bring the divine services into consonance with the will of the Almighty, as explained to us in the law and the prophets. So this is quite brave stuff. I want to suggest in 1842, he's saying, and he said this in Liverpool. As I said, Liverpool had a radical edge even in the Orthodox world. He said, no more second day Yom Tov. And we take it upon ourselves to say what we will do, and what we will do is Tanakh Judaism, if I can call it that, and not Mishnah and Talmud. He is sometimes called a neo-Karaite. Now, some of you will know a little bit. There's a Karaite synagogue in Jerusalem you may have seen, rather beautiful. And the Karaism comes from the Hebrew word mikra, scripture. And it was started by a man called Anan ben David in the 8th century of the Common Era. And it was very niche. But you can see why people call David Woolf Marks a neo-Karaite, because he said, no more do we do everything that the Mishnah and the Talmud says. We take upon ourselves, as non-Orthodox Jews have done from that time to this, we have the right, and indeed I think he would have said the duty, to look at Jewish tradition and think about, does that build our spiritual connection with the Almighty? Now, that was brave. And that brought down on his head all sorts of huge criticism from the Board of Deputies, from the Bevis Marks, where many of the families had come from the Great Synagogue, words like heresy and schism and secession. And, you know, it was pretty heavy stuff. And as I said, until many years later, there was this cherem, and people were not allowed, even the Orthodox ministers who really thought it was rather silly, were not allowed to marry one of the seceders, they were sometimes called, the West London members, or indeed bury them. Now, Moses Montefiore, I hope most of you know the name, was a completely fabulous man in very many ways, but not this one. He was really angry, and he had a lot of power, right? His own brother Horatio was involved. And he felt, and I suppose he had good cause, he'd flourished in Victorian society. He said he's not giving up the smallest amount of our religious forms and privileges to obtain civil rights. And he wrote to Sir Francis Goldsmith, I do not consider the place of worship in Burton Street referred to you to be a synagogue. So that's pretty hostile. And this went there and back for about 30 years. And in the end, it became as it was no longer a Broigust. I mean, I want to suggest, you may disagree with me, and that's fine. Quite a lot of it was a family Broigust. It was an argument between the bits of the Sephardi Jewish aristocracy that stayed at Bevis Marks and the bits that came to West London. Now, in 1871, so David Woolf Marks was still young, he said, quote, The new movement produced bitter feelings and angry excitement, but time and mature reflection have erased all intemperate feelings. At the Jubilee service, and we have in the synagogue, you're very welcome to visit, and I'll show it to you, wonderful pictures of this was what, 1892, right? So there's all these Victorian gentlemen in their top hats downstairs. Women, I'm sorry to say, were upstairs until long into the 20th century. There were Orthodox representatives at this big event. So I think that the upset had largely dissipated by the end of Victoria's reign. You can tell by the way I'm speaking about him, I'm deeply fond of David Woolf Marks. I think he was a wonderful, insightful, brave pioneer. What he wasn't was consistent. I said he is sometimes described as a neo-Karaite. The mitzvah of lighting candles on Shabbat, it's not in the Torah or the Tanakh, it's a rabbinic minhag. But even David Woolf Marks, radical that he was, wasn't going to say, don't do that. They celebrated Hanukkah. Now, you probably know that Hanukkah is most certainly a post-biblical celebration. They tried and failed. Even David Woolf Marks wasn't a success in everything. He tried to put together a Passover Haggadah for Seder night without rabbinic passages. Well, it kind of flopped. And if you think about the Haggadah we know and love, you couldn't have that. Okay, so Simon Montague, hi Simon, is asking a very good question. Sacrifices were out day one. They had the courage to say, when we talk about the Messianic age, we're talking about an age of peace and tranquility for all humanity. Okay, so Anthony's saying, what was the Reform view of the divine authorship of the Torah? That's a very good question. And they were a little bit vague. So what they tended to say, and I'm going to try and explain this because there's a slight but subtle and important difference between the Reform and the Liberal view. And obviously Liberal came in the early 20th century. They believed that the Torah was divinely inspired, right? But not dictated by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, okay? So what that meant was that you could look, and as I keep saying, David Woolf Marks was very courageous and very clear about what he felt, and he taught the community in his wonderful sermons. He was much loved preacher. You could look at the Holy Torah and as being divinely inspired, but written down, and I often say this when I'm teaching Jews by choice, written down by fallible human beings. Now, that meant all human beings are fallible, right? So you could look at the Torah and you can say, that's really beautiful, and that's there for the ages, something like the Ten Commandments, right? And you could look at the Torah and something like, we're just coming into the book of Leviticus. Some of you will know the section I mean when I talk about Tazria Metzora. It's the section we're just coming up to that deals with, well, it's often translated as leprosy. It's not. There's a skin disease called Sara'at, right? Now, if you were on the more radical side, you would say, and I remember having this exact conversation with a liberal rabbi, sadly no longer with us, would say, don't read, read Kedoshim instead. That is spiritually uplifting. But David Woolf Marks would not have been a fan of that, as indeed nor am I, because what he would have said is read Tazria Metzora, and you, modern Jew, with your educated conscience, your job is to try and find if you like, the divine spark in a piece of text that is pretty difficult for modern people. And I'm going to give you two tiny examples from Tazria Metzora. If you read what the Torah says about this strange disease of tsara'at that can affect your house, your clothes, or your body in succession. When I've studied it with people more recently, and you send the person out of the camp and so on and so on. The feedback I get from people is they say, do you know, that reminds me of what we did during COVID. And it's a very appropriate association because, of course, the priests were the ancient doctors. So that's one, what I like to think David Woolf Marks sort of approved of, way of looking at a difficult Torah portion. The other one, and it's a classic rabbinic one, Metzora can be split into two words, motzi ra, one who finds evil. And it's a chance to speak against gossip and unkindness. So it is possible, if you believe the whole 5 books of Moses, it's divine inspired, to find something inspirational, even in the difficult bits. So somebody asked me about prayer books. They had we had recently, when we celebrated the 175th anniversary of the Synagogue in 2015, we managed to get hold of, from the archives, the 1840 service. Really interesting, really interesting. Very little Hebrew, I will tell you. And they did, if I remember correctly, they had a version of Kaddish in Hebrew. You all know that Kaddish is Aramaic, but as you know, David Woolf Marks was a professor of Hebrew at University College. And he did as I said, he was a genius, I think, but he wasn't consistent. They did Hanukkah and they did Purim because it was deeply in people's hearts, though he said without a bracha. And he did this kind of rather, I think, rather endearing thing, because human beings, when you come to religious practice, probably none of us are very consistent. He wasn't a fan of wearing tefillin. What goes in your tefillin is in the Tanakh, but the shape is given by the rabbis. But Tisha B'Av afternoon, he wore tefillin, which is quite sweet and quite endearing. David Woolf Marks was an extraordinary influence on Reform Judaism in the UK. Immediately via the West London Synagogue, he had this connection with University College, where he was the professor of Hebrew. He had foreign dignitaries coming to see him at the West London Synagogue. And he started a tradition that goes on to this very day of being open to the wider society for interfaith connections with, well, in those days it would have been churches, now it's with mosques and gurdwaras as well. And I think probably the things that were most influential was the sense that tikkun olam matters. To do good in the world is really important. You may be the most rigidly Orthodox Jew who keeps as many of the 613 mitzvot as you're able to, but if you're not doing good in the world, something is missing. And he was this wonderful amalgam of deeply rooted in Jewish tradition. Remember, he'd gone to JFS and he was so brilliant. He was teaching younger children almost from day one. Deeply rooted in Jewish tradition. A beautiful, powerful, gifted preacher. So much so that, as I say, there's 2 books of his sermons being published, available on Amazon if you're interested. And he was able to bring the West London Synagogue of British Jews, and he was proud of bringing Ashkenazim and Sephardim together, so that people would come, and they still come. We have people at the West London Synagogue. Got one family that are 6 generations, West London, because to have somewhere where to be proud of being British and Jewish in a marriage that is both loving and honouring of Jewish tradition and honouring of being involved in wider society was a gift that David Woolf Marks gave us and has handed down the generation. So I'm not going to say any more. I'm going to open for questions and comments.
Rabbi Helen, I've got a couple of pictures to show as well. So should I?
Yes, if you would, yeah.
Including one that Leo Beck College sent me, which I'm going to bring this one up first, if everyone can see that. That should be the first prayer book, I believe.
Yeah, that I mentioned, yes.
Yes.
The strange thing for me as a modern rabbi is he was never ordained. Now, when I started, I've known about David Woolf Marks forever. He's always known, it probably says there, Reverend Professor, usually did. Oh, no, it just says D.W. Marks, yeah. He was what was called in those days a lay minister. And somebody asked a very good question about when we started ordaining non-Orthodox rabbis in the UK. Well, the first non-Orthodox rabbis ordained, some of you may remember them. The first students at the Leo Beck College were the late, much lamented Lionel Bloom and the late, much lamented Michael Lee, who took over, if I remember my Reform history correctly, who took over from the late, much lamented Ignace Maybaum at Edgware.
Leonid said, just spoke today with a member of a Reformed Synagogue in St. Petersburg who refuses to cite blessings over halal as it is not commanded in the Torah. Similar mindset.
Yes. It's amazing. Okay, I wanted to show you, this is David Woolf Marks' tombstone. This is at Bulls Pond Road, from when I visited there. You can probably see there's an awful lot of writing on it. You can see David Woolf Marks, and down at the bottom it says Cecilia Sarah, which was his wife, who predeceased him by quite a long time. And the very lovely thing, which is why I'm very pleased that Bulls Pond Road is going to be renovated, God willing, is there's some really eminent Jewish Victorians buried at Bulls Pond Road. Some of you may know, quite a well-known, I think the first British Jewish novelist, woman novelist, was a lady called Amy Levy. Amy Levy wrote, she was a member of West London, which is why she's buried at Bulls Pond Road. She wrote a really interesting book called Reuben Sachs. And Reuben Sachs is not great literature, but what's amazingly interesting is 2 things. One, she talks about the struggle, and this is what David Woolf Marks was addressing, being both British and Jewish. And she was talking about, as a young person, how do you meet someone that you're going to marry? And we begin to see in the late Victorian times how much of a struggle that was to do within the Jewish community. And the other thing that I love Amy Levy for, she talks about sitting upstairs at the West London Synagogue in Berkeley Street. And somebody showed me where she used to sit behind a pillar upstairs. But the thing she said, and this is why the Victorian tradition can be a really powerful one, even back then, she said, and this is almost a word-for-word quote, the music of Berkeley Street is absolutely wonderful. And it is, and it still is. Because, going back to David Woolf Marks, he wanted his synagogue to be a place where you could bring, he had a foreign emperor come visit and a king of somewhere. And you want to be proud of your synagogue. You want them to feel honoured and welcome, and it's decorous, and there's an interesting sermon, and it's Hebrew and English. And it all happened largely because of the energy and the enthusiasm and the positive attitude of David Woolf Marks.
Great. And I've got one final picture you might want to talk through is this one. Oh,
yes. The reason why I thought that one was interesting is, do you remember I said a little while ago he's often called, David Woolf Marks, Neo-Karaite. Do you remember I said he kind of was a bit. Mikra, the Hebrew word for scripture, is the root of calling people Karaites. And this is the Karaite synagogue in Jerusalem. And there were not a lot, there was a groups of Karaites in Russia right the way through medieval times. And it was really, really interesting when I was telling you about the bad feeling between the seceders, as they were often called, the founders of West London Synagogue, and Sir Moses Montefiore and the people in the Board of Deputies. In Russia, ironically and intriguingly, there was very bad feeling between the Karaites, small group in Russia, and what was called in ancient times the Rabbinites, the mainstream rabbinic Jews. So I just put that in there out of interest. Thought it was a nice picture.
Thank you. And one question in the chat that I don't think we've addressed yet was Patricia's question about what were Professor David Woolf Marks' attitudes towards conversion. Maybe we might also say mixed faith relationships, if there was such a thing.
No, there wasn't. The Jewish community in the late Victorian times, it was small, quite a lot of them. And I know because I've seen all the dedications to some of our beautiful stained glass windows. Quite a lot of them kind of would marry their second cousin or something. A gentleman called Patrick McCatter, who's our last chairman, but two. And he told me his great 3 or 4 or 5 great grandfather was the first chairman. So for the McCatter family, this beautiful synagogue, which if you haven't been, please come visit, was very significant. And we've only had maybe 6 or 7 senior rabbis, McCatters, were involved in the appointment of about 4 of them. So this sense that this is the family synagogue is really very powerful. And I'm going to finish, unless anyone else has got a question, with a very lovely and true story. On November the 23rd, this year just gone, I conducted an adult bar mitzvah for a wonderful gentleman who's 83, never had one at 30. And his name is Michael Quixano Henriquez. Remember, I said 19 of the 24 founding families were Sephardi. He had a bar mitzvah with his son and daughter, who, for all sorts of complicated reasons, also didn't have a bar mitzvah at 30. There was actually a picture, I think it was on Boxing Day in the Times, because it was such a wonderful story, because on the front of our bima, there's a beautiful kind of mosaic in memory of David Quixano Henriquez, who's the great-grandfather of the gentleman whose bar mitzvah I conducted only last year. So there really is a sense for quite a lot of people. It's the family synagogue. And they're very proud that they're descendants of the founders, are really proud that West London Synagogue is still passionate about prophetic Judaism and all the things that David Woolf Marks taught us. I'm going to stop.
Okay, so just like everyone to join me in saying a massive, massive thank you to Rabbi Helen. It was a fascinating talk about an incredible man that I knew didn't, and I'm sure a lot of people didn't know much about before today. So everyone, please say thank you.
You're hugely welcome. You really are.